advance in the army or in the imperial civil service, there's every incentive to become a Christian because all the people at the top are Christians. So, you know, if you want to advance in the hierarchy, whether it's military, civil service, or just at court, people become Christians.
It becomes very attractive because Constantine's Edict of Toleration makes it so.
Constantine can rightfully claim the title of great, for he turned the history of the world into a new course and made Christianity, which until then had suffered bloody persecution, the religion of the state.
And so, as people from around the Roman Empire entered the Christian church, they brought with them many of their former pagan beliefs and practices.
Now that Christianity has been given the status as a full legal religion, then it becomes attractive subsequently in the next generations for a broad number of members of this upper elite. Now the percentage of Christians in this top 10, 15, 25% increases, and it increases dramatically in the top 1-2%. That's the real change. That is when Christianity really becomes the Christianity that it is today. Because now the people who've been running the show, they are now Christian.
Over time, church leaders began to embrace the regal robes and flamboyant ceremony that was part of the pagan religions. And in place of the simple commands of God, they began to teach superstitions and man-made traditions. Now, instead of the Christian church converting the heathen world, the pagans were converting the church.
There's a train coming out of the first century represented by the documents we have in the New Testament that demonstrate kind of the shape of the church there, going into this long dark tunnel of the 2nd through 4th centuries, and then coming out in the 4th century of this long dark tunnel. And the train of the church that comes out is so different than the train of the church that goes in. You say, what happened?
In AD 391, by the order of Emperor Theodosius I, Christianity became the official state religion of Rome. Worship at pagan temples was outlawed, and all other religious practices ceased.
You're trying to Christianize an empire. You're trying to Christianize a pagan culture. The old basilicas were basically pagan temples. Put a cross over it. Put in paintings of biblical scenes, biblical heroes and saints and martyrs.
Christians are very purposeful and intentional about taking over pagan temples, and there's a notable church leader who actually writes this in a treatise that survives. He writes a rebuttal of pagan attacks on Christianity. And part of his evidence is he says, your very own places of worship are now Christian places of worship. We have taken them over, we have cleansed out the idolatry, we have sanctified them, and we have made them places where the one true God is worshipped. What clearer evidence could you wish that your whole system of belief is false? Where are your gods if they're allowing this to happen? So Christians actually deliberately at times and purposefully, as a strategy, take pagan not only places but rituals or ideas, and as they think, subvert them to advance the cause of, spreading Christianity. What we don't know is the extent to which they think this through and say, well, at what point is it legitimate to do this, and at what point do we perhaps begin to be taking on other ideas?
The speed with which the early church tobogganed into apostasy will take your breath away.
As millions of pagans hastily joined the church, they were naturally reluctant to dispose of their idol treasures. The Romans and the Greeks were so used to being surrounded by symbols of their deities. They began doing the same thing with Christianity. So many of these new converts just relabeled their idols with Christian names, like Paul, Mary, and Peter.
A statue of Jupiter became a statue of Peter.
And we know that because it has a sun disk right over its head that indicates that this is not Peter, but it's a pagan statue that's been renamed.
Instead of Romulus and Remus, hey, why not the martyrs, the great martyrs Cosmas and Damian, right?
The representations of Isis, which is originally an Egyptian goddess but has become very Greek already, becomes essentially the representation of Mary carrying her child.
You have a mother and child tradition all the way down through history. You have it in Mithraism, you have it in Babylon, You have it all the way back in Persia.
It appears that Mary acquired some of the characteristics that were associated with some of these other goddesses.
She wears a dark blue coat and she stands on the half moon. She is the mother of all gods. Isis carrying her son Horus. That is the image that gets a new name, and now the name is Mary carrying the child Jesus.
Or a depiction of the god Hermes is shown as Christ the Good Shepherd.
Asclepius is the iconographic model for a lot of the depictions of Jesus, yes. A young, vibrant god with curly hair, down to about here, and a little beard.
Soon the statues of the saints and even Jesus began adorning the churches. Even though God clearly forbids this practice in the Ten Commandments, people continue to revere and to pray to these relabeled idols.
Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them.
Related to the last point is the veneration of Mary, the mother of Jesus. While it is true, Mary was a faithful woman and greatly honored to be his mother, the scriptures teach nowhere that she's to be deified or worshipped.
Mary had always been important in ancient Christian history, but over the Middle Ages she becomes elevated almost to looking at it detachedly, almost to the rank of a semi-deity.
The Virgin Mary was believed to be the one who would speak up for guilty human beings to her supremely virtuous and judgmental and rather censorious son. It's a very strange image, but that's how the religious art of the period shows it.
The Bible does not venerate Mary as a special saint. It lifts her up as a pure, wonderful woman used by God to give birth to the Messiah.
Yet, at the Council of Nicaea in 325, the Church elevated Mary to the stature of a goddess and co-mediator with Christ. Even as early as the late 4th century, churches were being dedicated to the Virgin Mary. But sadly, these were not the only errors that slipped in during this time. During the Apostolic Age, baptism was a sacred ceremony reserved only for those old enough to make a rational decision for Christ. It was a public testimony of accepting Christ and his forgiveness. Baptism literally represents being dead and buried to our old life and being resurrected or born again to a new life in Christ.
It comes to be, in the course of the centuries, seen more as a rite of initiation into Christianity. And it begins happening at earlier stages of life, when you're sort of in late childhood or early adolescence, and deemed ready to make that commitment to your faith.
The baptism ceremony was also performed in a lake or a river where a person could be fully submerged, signifying they were fully washed from their sins. The practice of baptism was gradually altered by the Church. Hundreds of years after Christ, sprinkling and pouring was introduced as a more convenient mode of baptism. This actually undermined the powerful symbolism of the service, and it contradicts the example of Jesus, who was baptized by immersion.
And that continues to be the case up until about the 12th century, actually, because the 12th century is a time when theologians are really re-examining Christian doctrine, and they come to conclude that original sin, the sin that all of humanity has as a result of the fall in the Garden of Eden, exists in the soul from the moment of birth.
There was this unbiblical concept that a child could sin right away, and so therefore if he sinned, he was in danger of going to hell and burning forever in hell. So the only way to take care of him was to baptize him. And he had to be baptized into the church. If you weren't a member of the church, it was tickets for you.
So theologians say, you know what, we need to start baptizing babies immediately, as soon as possible after they're born, so that in case they die, and of course this is a period when infant mortality is high and a lot of babies do die, they can get into heaven.
Another Christian truth that was altered by pagan influence was the Lord's Supper. Jesus instituted the communion service, also known by some as the Eucharist, to be a beautiful yet simple ceremony where his followers would drink unfermented wine and eat unleavened bread. These symbols of Jesus' sinless body and blood are designed to help believers remember the sacrifice and the teachings of Christ.
By far the most important rite for late medieval Christians was the Eucharist or communion, or as they most commonly called it, the Mass.
Men and women all come together and take the sacrament. They celebrate what we would call communion, taking the body and blood of Jesus Christ.
But again, under the influence of heathen rituals, the Holy Communion service was gradually changed by church leaders into a mystical ceremony. In this new ritual, fermented wine was used, and the priest, allegedly, had the power to transform the bread and the wine into the actual body and blood of Christ.
This is transubstantiation, the notion that a priest transforms the Eucharist into the body and blood of Christ through the pronunciation and the formula, hoc est enum corpus meum, this is my body.
They were powerful words believed to have the property that when they were uttered, God transformed the nature of the bread and the wine into the body and blood of the risen Jesus Christ.
Even to the point where later on they say, we are creating God by speaking the words of mystagogy.
Essentially, what happened on the altar was that bread became body, wine became blood, but they just still looked like bread and wine.
This offering of the sacrifice in the Eucharist, this sacrifice of praise, this communal meal, now becomes not a remembrance of the sacrifice, but a sacrifice in of itself, and is giving salvation.
They believed and they taught that in the Mass, Jesus Christ, in the person of the priest, sacrifices Christ to God the Father, and thereby wins good, wins a quantum of holiness, which the Church can then assign to the beneficiaries of that Mass. Because people believed that by celebrating a Mass you were doing something good which was offered up to God, there was a theological rationale for doing it lots and lots of times.
By 1415 AD, at the Council of Constance, church leaders further decreed that only the priests could drink the wine and the laity would only receive the bread. Yet the Bible clearly says that when Jesus established the communion service, they all drank from it. About 300 years after Christ, the church began to deviate from another of the 10 commandments, specifically the 4th commandment that requires believers to remember the 7th day as the Sabbath.
Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God.
In the Roman Empire, Jews are an old religion, and old religions are respected. When the Jews kept fighting against Rome, what had been kind of an umbrella of safety under Judaism becomes a lightning rod to Christianity.
The Christians become alienated from the Jews. Jews persecuted them, and so they're trying to distance themselves from the Jews.
Church leaders began to devalue the 7th-day Sabbath of the 10 Commandments in preference for the more popular Roman Sunday.
Some Christians mistakenly thought that you should fast on the Sabbath, but you could feast on Sunday. That's what the pagans did. They feasted on Sunday, fasted on Saturday. Not a Jewish concept. The Jews fasted Friday and feasted Sabbath. But that's how some Christians thought of it. So if you're fasting on one day and you're feasting on the next, you can guess which day becomes the more popular day.
And Christ is resurrected on a Sunday, and there's a very natural tendency, therefore, to mark that and celebrate that.
There's a third reason, and that is the influence of sun worship that creeps into the church. And when sun worship begins to creep into the church, Constantine can make use of that to lead to the exaltation of Sunday, the day of the sun, as being the day that people should worship on.
This gradual departure from God's law over the centuries has become so widely accepted that most are shocked to learn that Sunday keeping has no foundation in the Bible. In AD 313, Constantine published the Edict of Milan, establishing Sunday as a day of rest. The emperor's Sunday law had nothing to do with Christianity. It was actually to honor the main Greco-Roman sun god called Helios, or Apollo.
The Emperor Constantine became a convert to Christianity, and also because he remained partial to the sun god, the Emperor Constantine moved the day of worship from Saturday, the Sabbath, as had been traditional in Judaism, obviously, to Sunday, the day of the sun god. And ever since, Christian folks, at least for the most part, overwhelmingly, have held their day of worship on Sunday rather than Saturday.
This is clear from another edict of Constantine given in AD 321, when the emperor ordered,
"On the venerable day of the sun, let the magistrates and people residing in cities rest, and let all workshops be closed."
Notice, the edict uses the word sun, S-U-N. It's also recorded that Constantine the Great made a law for the whole empire that Sunday should be kept as a day of rest. Obviously, this change did not infiltrate the church overnight. History tells us that for decades, the seventh-day Sabbath, together with Sunday, were both observed as holy days.
The very, very early church clearly is still worshipping on the Jewish Saturday in the times of the apostles. But by the mid to late 3rd century, that has largely been abandoned or is in the process of being abandoned. By the early 4th century, in many parts of the Roman world, Christians are generally worshipping on Sunday.
A lot of Christians during this period of time would observe the Sabbath, and then on Sunday they would have a service remembering the resurrection, and then they'd go about their regular work. It's during the time of Constantine in which the idea of transferring the solemnity of the Sabbath to Sunday is first expressed.
Centuries earlier, the prophet Daniel had foretold a religious power would arise that would think to change times and laws. Within the 10 Commandments, there's only one law that is also a time: the Sabbath. The doctrine of hellfire was also distorted.